This video is for you if you're considering buying or selling a property in Dubai. The process of purchasing a secondary market property in Dubai is relatively straightforward, transparent, and fast compared to most other parts of the world. Whether you're looking to buy or sell a property, and whether it's a ready or under construction property, understanding this process is crucial. It helps you make informed decisions and ensure the best protection of your rights, your time, and your money to maximize efficiency and minimizing costs throughout the buying or selling journey. First thing I want to discuss with you is the inspection advice. When buying a property, especially in the resale market, it's crucial to do an inspection. This lets you look over the property's condition from its structure to the utilities and any appliances or furniture that comes with it. Hiring a professional inspector is a great idea. They can spot any problems that might need fixing, which could help you negotiate the price if needed. A detailed inspection gives you a clear view of what you're buying, and it will give you a peace of mind. Next point I want to discuss with you is about the payments and title transfer. In Dubai, all payments in the secondary market transactions are typically made at the time of ownership transfer only to protect both the buyer and the seller. This is the preferred practice to avoid risks, ensuring that the payments are made upon the official transfer of the property ownership. Some buyers may agree to pay a down payment to the seller upon signing and before the execution of the ownership transfer. However, we generally advise against it, and we recommend full payments upon the ownership transfer only. In Dubai's real estate market, after agreeing on the price and the date of the ownership transfer, a sales and purchase contract is signed between the buyer and the seller. This agreement must be the standard contract provided by the Dubai Land Department, which is digital and created through the Dubai Land Department system. This contract is called Contract F. It is electronically signed by both parties, and during its validity period, the sale of the property to anyone other than the registered buyer will not be possible by the system. The Contract F is prepared digitally by the seller's agent. If your real estate agent represents both the buyer and the seller, they will provide the contract. If there are separate agents for the buyer and the seller, then after agreeing on the price, transfer date, and any additional terms, it's the seller's agent's responsibility to create this Contract F. The main terms and contents of the Contract F cannot be altered or edited, and the agents must include and specify any agreed upon terms and conditions between the buyer and the seller at the end of the contract under the additional terms section. About the additional terms, here I explained the most important rules, key points, and the most common terms of real estate sales and purchase contracts in Dubai. And I recommend that for a greater emphasis and more clarity, when buying or selling a property, ask your agent and make sure that these points are mentioned in the additional terms sections of your sales and purchase contract. This way, both the buyer, seller, and even the agent will have a clear and transparent understanding of these points and agreements, and the likelihood of potential issues will be minimized, and it will bring you closer to a seamless experience. This approach ensures that your transaction is smoother, faster, and accompanied by an easy and enjoyable experience that protects your rights, your money, and your time. Make sure that the date of the ownership transfer and the date of applying the transfer NOC are specified and mentioned in the contract. The transfer NOC is a no objection certificate from the developer or the owner's association of the building or the project, which indicates that at the time of the NOC request, the seller has no outstanding payments for installments or service charges of the property, and there are no objections to transferring the ownership of that property. Note that the NOCs are usually valid for 15 days. Therefore, request the transfer NOC when you are ready to proceed with the ownership transfer within its validity period. So you will avoid the need for a new transfer NOC. The transfer NOC fee is usually 525 dirhams for ready properties and 5,000 plus VAT or 5,250 dirhams for properties which are under construction, which the seller pays it to the developer when requesting the transfer NOC. In some cases, there is an agreement between the buyer and the seller that the buyer will reimburse this amount to the seller at the time of the ownership transfer. The transfer NOC fee does not exceed 5,000 plus VAT or 5,250 dirhams. At the time of signing the sales and purchase contract, the buyer issues a security deposit check, which is typically 10% of the property's purchase price payable to the seller. This security deposit check should remain in escrow with the real estate agent until the date of the ownership transfer and will be returned to the buyer upon the successful transfer of the property ownership. The purpose of this security deposit check is to make sure of good faith in completing the transaction. If the buyer breaches the contract and backs out or withdraws from the deal, and this breach is confirmed and determined by the court, the seller may use this check following a court order as a compensation for the buyer's default and back out from the deal. Another key condition to include in your contract is how the buyer plans to pay, especially if they are relying on a mortgage. The deal could depend on the buyer's mortgage being approved for a specific minimum amount. If the mortgage isn't approved by a certain date, or if approved amount is less than a certain amount, the buyer might have the option to either continue and go through with the purchase or cancel the deal and exit without penalties. In that case, the contract would be considered null and void. When buying a property is depending on a bank loan, it's important to discuss and agree on this point upfront. The result of your agreement should be clearly stated in your sales and purchase contract to make sure that if the mortgage conditions differ from the buyer's expectations, the rights and obligations of both the buyer and the seller are clearly defined and understood in advance. The next point is about whether the property is rented or vacant. If it's rented and the lease is registered and updated in the Ijari system, the rent amount and payment date will automatically show up in the main part of the sales and purchase contract. For rented properties, it's a good idea for buyers to review the tenancy contract terms and details before signing the contract. Usually, it's agreed that the rental income will be divided fairly based on the day of the ownership transfer. Means, until the day of transfer, the rent goes to the seller, and from that day on, it goes to the buyer. This arrangement for rent payments after the transfer should be clearly mentioned in the contract. After the transfer, the buyer signs a new rental contract with the tenant that keeps the same terms, dates, and rent amount as the current tenancy agreement. In other words, the change in ownership does not affect the tenant's lease terms, amount, or contract expiry date. When buying a rented property, also keep in mind that if an official eviction notice has not been served to the tenant, the expiry date of the tenancy agreement does not necessarily mean that the tenant has to vacate the property by that date. For the rental laws and rights of the landlords and the tenants, I will prepare a separate detailed video and I will share it with you. If the property you are buying is not rented, specify in the sales and purchase contract whether the furniture, equipment, and the conditions of the unit are included or not. If the property has furniture or equipment, it is recommended to attach a list or preferably the photos of the furniture to the contract, signed by both the buyer and the seller to clarify and clearly identify the items sold with the property. Besides, in case of any missing keys, entry cards, or access cards for the building's shared facilities, common areas, for these kind of accessories, clearly negotiate, agree upon, and specify in the contract any arrangements between buyer and the seller, like compensation or replacement fees for keys, cards, or any other missing accessory. Utility bills for things like water, electricity, gas, facilities, and etc. should be settled on the day of the ownership transfer, unless the buyer and the seller agree otherwise. Just make sure to keep this in mind and clearly include any agreement about these payments in your contract. For the service charges and common areas fees, the standard practice in Dubai's real estate market is to calculate these fees on a pro rata basis on the day of the transfer and settle them between the buyer and the seller. Service charges are the responsibility of the seller up until the transfer date, and after that, they are the responsibility of the buyer. To calculate the daily service charge and rental income on the day of the ownership transfer, you can ask assistance from your agent. It's a good idea to review these calculations and numbers a day before the transfer just to make sure that they are accurate. forward. Delays and force majeure. One point we make clear in the sales and purchase contract is the cooperation, goodwill, and obligations of both parties to provide the required documents and take the required actions at the required times in accordance with the instructions, guidelines, and policies of the developer, Dubai Land Department, and related authorities. We suggest mentioning that any delay or restriction from the developer or Dubai Land Department or trustee office or any other government authority, or any delay due to an unforeseeable act of nature or force majeure, or anything that is beyond the buyer's or seller's control and will, shall not be considered as a breach of contract by either party, and the agreement shall be automatically extended by 30 days, for example. And any further extension will be made only with the mutual agreement of the parties. Whatever your agreement is on this, I suggest keeping it clear and transparent in your contract. Both parties to the contract, the buyer and the seller, must be aware that in the event of a default, a claim for the compensation penalty will be filed with the Dubai courts against the defaulting party. In this instance, agent will, of course, serve as a witness. For the breakdown of payments, it is recommended that all payments payable by the buyer and the seller be clearly and completely listed in a separate clause in your contract, in the additional terms. For secondary sales of off-plan properties, these costs typically include the purchase price, also known as the original price of the property, amount already paid by the seller to the developer, selling price of the property, transfer fee, which is 4% of the selling price, trustee office fees, which is 2,100 dirhams for transactions under 500,000, and 4,200 dirhams for transactions of 500,000 dirham or more. Title deed and site plan fees, which is up to 580 dirhams, commission payable by the seller and commission payable by the buyer, which could range between 0 to 20% each. So clearly specifying all these fees and who is responsible for each one in the contract is highly recommended. In secondary sales of off-plan properties, the amount payable by the buyer to the seller is equal to the amount already paid by the seller to the developer, plus the difference between the original price and selling price, that we call it the premium. So paid plus premium is the payable amount. After the transfer, any subsequent installment payments according to the payment plan, which is usually linked to the construction progress, will be the responsibility of the buyer, who will pay these to the developer in the future. When reselling an off-plan property, in most cases, if an installment is due within 1 month from the date of the transfer NOC request, that installment must be usually settled before applying the transfer NOC. The resale conditions of under construction properties may vary for each unit and project. Some off-plan properties may require reaching a specific payment percentage or completing all installments even before requesting the transfer NOC. Make sure to review these terms in the sales and purchase agreement, or consult the developer's customer service department for clarification. For resale of fully paid properties, there is no need to mention the original price or the seller's purchase price, of course. For a better clarity and transparency, you can add a clause to your contract stating that all taxes, fees, and charges are responsibility of the seller up to the transfer date and the responsibility of the buyer after the transfer date. Now, let me give you a quick review of property blocking system before the transfer. When the seller bought the property with a mortgage and still has a bank loan on it, there is a process called property blocking to make sure that the buyer does not have to clear the seller's mortgage upfront before the transfer. After signing the sales and purchase contract, the seller asks their bank for a liability letter. Once they get it, they give a copy to the buyer. The buyer will prepare 3 manager's checks, 1 to pay off the mortgage, 1 for the remaining amount owed to the seller, and 1 for the Dubai Land Department transfer fees. The buyer and the seller or their legal representatives will visit the trustee office with the transfer NOC, passports, IDs, and these manager's checks, and they request property blocking which involves a small fee of about 1,500 dirhams. At this point, the property is blocked in the Dubai Land Department system. After blocking, the bank's manager's check will be used to pay off the seller's mortgage, and once the mortgage is cleared and the bank provides a clearance letter or a mortgage release letter, the transfer can go through without needing the buyer or the seller to be present again in the trustee office. After that, the seller or their representative or authorized persons can collect the checks, the manager's check from the trustee office, and the buyer will get the new title deed by email and can also access it through the DubaiRealEstate app. If this blocking process is involved in your deal, it's a good idea to outline these steps in your contract. Also, when either party uses a mortgage, each is responsible for their own costs of registering or deregistering their mortgage. Also keep in mind that when buying a property in Dubai, it's important to understand the regulations of anti-money laundering and know your customer, AML and KYC. These rules help prevent illegal financial activities and make real estate transactions more transparent. We, real estate companies and agents, are required to follow certain regulations of AML, like verifying the identities, confirming the source of wealth and source of funds. So you will need to provide the necessary documents and information like ID, proof of address, your financial details and documents to meet the AML and KYC requirements. To wrap up, just a reminder that in Dubai, thanks to the advanced technologies used by the Dubai Land Department, all real estate transactions from buying and selling to ownership transfer and lease agreements are done electronically with no physical paperwork needed. This fully paperless approach doesn't just cut down on paperwork, but also makes everything more transparent, speeds up the process, and makes things more convenient for everyone, investors, residents, and real estate professionals here in Dubai. I hope the topics covered in this video are helpful to you and that by raising awareness, they lead to more transparency, more convenience, and the protection of the rights and money and assets of buyers and sellers. Thank you for liking this video and sharing it with your friends. Please feel free to leave your comments and questions in the comment section or send me a message. My colleagues and I will be more than happy to assist you.